Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will get started in just a moment. In the meantime, we would love to take a quick poll of who is in the audience. So you should see the poll up on the screen. If you have a chance to drop in, where in the tech ecosystem are you and your work located? We'll give it about 30 more seconds for folks to join and add in their destination location in the tech ecosystem. Destination and location could be two different things. Looks like the majority are coming from the tech workforce. We've got about 25, a little less than 25% other. Okay, well, I'm really glad to see that we have representation across all levels of the tech ecosystem. So it should make for a very robust conversation. Very thrilled to have our guests here today. We have one more poll for you before we get started. So we would love to just hear really quickly, did you read the full report? Did you skim some sections? Or do you need to get up to speed? That'll help us kind of gear our comments towards your needs. Of course, we expect everyone read the full report, every last detail, right? It's okay. All right. So panel, we're going to get everyone up to speed today. Wonderful. Okay. So thank you all for joining us today in a panel discussion about the data, the trends, and recommendations in our newest report released in partnership with the NAACP called The State of Diversity in Tech, the Black Tech Ecosystem. My name is Allison Scott, and I'm the CEO of the Cape Porter Center. For those of you who are new to our work, we work at the intersection of racial justice and technology. And our overarching mission is to create a more equitable technology ecosystem that addresses longstanding racial inequality, creates opportunity, and reflects the power and perspectives of communities of color. We've been closely monitoring these trends around the lack of diversity in tech, and specifically the lack of Black representation, for over a decade. We've been conducting research, we've been raising awareness, working in coalition with partner organizations and advocacy groups, and launching programming, all to address these critical disparities. In the early 2000s, there was little sustained focus or attention to racial disparities in technology. Around 2013, we began to see a push for transparency on data, demonstrating just how small Black representation in tech was, and leading to calls to action, diversity plans, trainings, and the proliferation of diversity officers. In the intervening years, we found that study after study revealed significant challenges in diversity in the tech sector. And after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, we also saw a flood of commitments by tech companies to invest in Black talent, to increase their Black representation, and to address broader societal implications of racism. So the purpose of this report was to take a longitudinal and holistic view of the technology ecosystem, from K-12 education through post-secondary, the workforce, and entrepreneurship. And we wanted to truly examine whether we have made progress towards racial equity. Our report finds that despite these commitments, in 2022, the progress towards racial equity and the inclusion of Black students, Black engineers, Black entrepreneurs, and Black investors has stalled. The data truly is dismal, and the problem is urgent. I often say that technology is at the center for the fight for racial justice, given the important role that tech plays in our lives, the rapid and continual growth of the tech economy, and the connection between technology and economic mobility, not to mention the harms of technological innovation that impact communities of color. So it is our hope that this report that we released and the conversation today with our amazing group of experts from across the tech sector will lead to significant action to increase Black representation across the tech sector. Before I introduce our amazing moderator to kick off our conversation, let's get a sense for our representation. I think we'll do the poll one more time. Okay, so we still have an abundance in the tech workforce, some in K-12, some in post-secondary, a couple of folks interested in alternative pathways, that'll be wonderful, majority in the tech workforce, and venture capital. Thank you so much for participating. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for our discussion today, Lisa Galopter. Lisa is the CEO and co-founder of Techwitable, former Chief Digital Service Officer for the Department of Education. And Lisa has had a long and successful career in the tech sector, and she brings a wealth of personal and professional experience to this conversation. And we are thrilled to have her moderate this panel. Lisa.
Thanks, Allison. I am super grateful to be able to engage with you all in this conversation. As you may or may not know, so I'm a Black woman with a degree in computer science, although admittedly it did take me 24 years to get my bachelor's degree, but I got there, and I've been working in tech for about 30 years. And so this conversation is not only near and dear to my heart personally, but also I've kind of watched the evolution or lack thereof over the last few decades in terms of the makeup of STEM education alongside the manifestation and the results of that in the workplace. So this is absolutely a conversation that I'm thrilled to be. I'm so glad to see the report. I'm so glad to be part of this conversation. So thank you for inviting me to moderate. I would like to introduce your fellow panelists, and I'm going to ask them in the spirit of trying to keep this relatively brief, just for them to say their name, their organization, their title, and then personally, why do you think doing this report and study is so critical as it relates to your role? So I'm going to kick off with Dr. Ivory Tolson.
Thank you so much. My name is Ivory Tolson. I'm the National Director of Education, Innovation, and Research for the NAACP. I'm also a professor in the School of Education at Howard University. Like I said in the report, I think that diversity in tech and Black representation in tech is a modern civil rights issue because of all of the factors that Dr. Allison Scott said earlier.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Thank you for that. I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Tamara Pearson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamara Pearson. I'm the director of the Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM at Spelman College. I'm very excited to be here. I love the work of the Caper Center. I think that this report is extremely important. In terms of specifically how this relates to my work, I'm really interested in how Black women are involved in these conversations, specifically how we are bringing an intersectional lens to marginalization of communities of color by the tech industry and how we can help to disrupt that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Super important. I would like to invite Ken and Scott to the stage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kenan Scott. He, him. I am the vice president of Bitwise Oakland, meaning I bring this wonderful ecosystem that was built in Fresno to my home city of Oakland, which I'm so excited for and so happy to be doing. Personally, this work, I have walked the pipeline. I have been a drop that made it through. I have gone back and tried to capture all the other drops and droplets that have not. And so this work has been the life's blood, or my life's blood, for the past 13 years. So this is a beautiful place to be. I love the report because it brings out hard facts, and we need to talk about hard facts and stop talking around them.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I would like to invite Samar Youssef to join us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to meet everybody and honored to be here today. I'm Samar Youssef. I am Chief Program Officer at Black VC. And the reason why this is so critical to me in the work that we do is that from the venture perspective, that's only one side of the table, and really reaching equity across the board from an economic equality perspective requires a more diverse tech workforce, a more diverse startup pipeline, and much more inclusive capital, right? And so this work can't be done in a silo, and the folks on this panel and others in the auditorium that are pushing similar initiatives kind of have to work in unison to be able to really have an impact in the space.
Fantastic. Yeah, you're so right on all the levels. And then we've already heard from Dr. Allison Scott, but as one of the key writers of the report, I would invite you to join us. And maybe as part of your intro, since we do have to catch some people up, I think there's maybe, I think the question for everybody to think about is this idea about having read the report, what most surprised you about the report. But maybe, Allison, you can start with some of the key things that, having been so deep in this research, that really stood out to you, and then maybe additional things that really got to you specifically.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to my fellow panelists. And I also want to give a quick shout out to the report main authors, Dr. Sonia Koshy and Rachel Goins. So I think what was really surprising for me, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but it was just the articulation through data of the lack of progress that really has been made. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of conversation, a lot of momentum action across the tech sector. And I think it was really, frankly, disheartening to see the lack of progress that's been made. A couple of the key data points I think that stick out that I know we'll dive deeper into include the continual lack of access to K-12 computer science courses for Black students, and the lack of participation in computer science at the K-12 level among Black students, despite all of these commitments, all of the broadening participation movement, the CS for All movement. We still are excluding Black talent early on in the pipeline. And then to bookend, similarly at the venture capital and entrepreneurship space, all of these commitments, lots of attention and focus, and where are the resources, and the amount of dollars being deployed to Black entrepreneurs is like barely budged at all. So I think those are two like really big findings that I think are emblematic of the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, that resonates with me. For the rest of you, was there anything else that you would want to add that really hit home? You all can just jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely set it off. I put it in the chat because it was the piece around inequity at the apprenticeship level. I think that for me, sitting in a space where a lot of my work is now transitioned into that realm of workforce development and making the change around how we even create more on-ramps and what it looks like to create equitable on-ramps, to see that one that seems so skills-based could have such a filter placed on it yet again. Another barrier put in place somewhere that I saw as like almost a return to a foolproof strategy from the 50s and 40s, right? But no, there's still the challenge that exists. There's still the racism that exists, and I thought that hit home. That hit hard, and I was like, I had to even hit so props to the writers, because I had to hit all the research document links to be like, no, say it ain't so.
Yeah, definitely resonated.
I would say that it wasn't necessarily surprising in terms of the data, but I was really happy that CAPER included a section around HBCUs. I know Dr. Schultz and I are both at HBCUs, and the role HBCUs play in diversifying the STEM pipeline is often not kind of brought to the forefront. So I was really happy to see that, and I was also happy to see that it was connected to the lack of funding that HBCUs and the disparities of funding within HBCUs versus PWIs, I think is extremely important to point out. So I was just happy that thread was included.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll co-sign that. You see, I'm representing the Mecca Howard University right now. But I was pleased to see that in the report, the call out to HBCUs, because it's vitally important.
Yeah. Sam, or anything that jumped out for you?
Everybody said, but also specifically Allison mentioned on, making it very clear how much progress is actually happening versus how much is being said is happening, right? There's a lot of boasting, there's a lot of pledges, promises, corporate engagement strategies, and yet, like, you look at the numbers, right? Funding to Black entrepreneurs, abysmal, right? Like, it's still, within the 1%, and like even when you dig down deeper, right? There was a few Black unicorns in this past year that ended up consolidating a large chunk of that capital that actually moved, right? So if you take out the outliers and look at the averages, right, and the medians, I think that paints a really like stark image of where the capital is actually flowing in the ecosystem. And then when you dig deeper, right, and you look at the intersections, look at funding to Black women, it's even worse, right? So I think the data is critical, because then we can have very honest conversations with people in power about, what is the results of these things that they're committing to, right? And if it ain't working, like, we gotta change something. So
right. Yeah. I thank you all for that, because I think that just really gave us fodder for the conversation I think that we're about to have. And so it's right, the beginning of the pipeline is obviously in K-12 education. And so I would just like to pose to Ken and Allison almost that exact same question, right? Which is like, we have been talking about this for forever, for at least like the last 10 years. And Do you all have any insight as to what the holdups are or why nothing has changed? What are the impediments? Or how, or what could be done? More importantly, like, can we, like, do you have thoughts on what can be done?
I'll just start by just giving. Yeah, that's always interesting when that happens. I'll just begin by saying that Dr. Scott and I have been looking at this conundrum for the last decade, right? Really tearing it apart and trying to understand some of the barriers, plowing through a lot of the ones that were highlighted in the report. And then there's just a sustainability challenge that I feel like we are running into. It's like, how do we sustain these efforts once they happen? Once we get a cohort of, Black STEM teachers, what do we do to make sure they make it through 5 years to 10 years in the classroom? Or what are we doing to make sure that their curriculum moves into other spaces so that we are in fact bringing cultural relevance to every classroom where there aren't Black teachers even, right? And I think it's just, I as I read this part, Allison, I was just thinking about all of our work and just being like, we've done so much. Like, we really have poured so much into policy. And yeah, I'm gonna divert to you for a second while my mic does weird things.
Well, I will just pick up where you left off, Kenan. Kenan and I have worked together. Kenan previously worked in Oakland Unified School District, building out their K-12 computer science pathways. And I think what you're alluding to is incredibly important. And when I go back to, if I can kind of look backwards 10 years and say, like, where have we gone wrong in order to inform where we should go in the next 10 years, I think, one, we did not have an intentionality around racial equity. We had like these general kind of like CS for all movements, like everyone should take computer science, and yes, everyone should take computer science, and how do you address the existing disparities? So 10 years later, we're now seeing the same exact disparities exist. And then the second piece is we didn't, as a collective, we didn't make systemic investments. So we didn't try to change like education systems and structures that would allow us to have the sustainability that Ken had mentioned. So everything from like, how do we do teacher credentialing? How do we invest resources? How do we, intentionally support rural districts, low income districts, urban districts. And so I think those are some of the challenges that we've seen. And just to summarize for some of the folks that haven't seen all of the data, essentially what we're still saying is about half of students across the country lack access to computer science courses. This is very acute for Black students and low-income students. And we need like systemic change. We need policies, we need deep investments, and we need intentionality around how do we close racial equity gaps in computer science. And the one other thing I would say is thinking about how do we teach computer science is a conversation that's like coming to the forefront now, but it wasn't in the early conversations. We weren't thinking about culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy and how to engage students from all backgrounds in computer science education. So those are just a couple examples from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Oh, sorry, was somebody going to add on?
Yeah, I do want to chime in too, because I see that the majority of people who are watching is from the tech workforce. And I don't want anyone from the tech workforce to be confused and to think that the reason why they lack Black representation is because of something that's happening at the K through 12 level, because that's not true. Now, there are these disparities, and these disparities are real. We have to do something about it. And they can contribute to the problem, but they are not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is biases in the way that the tech workforce selects the people who they want to hire. So it's people from tech having someone with a degree from an HBCU, especially an HBCU that they haven't heard of, and are not giving them an interview. Is them not acknowledging that there are some students who go through the community college system and the vocational education system, and they are just as good at computers as someone who went to some of these R1 institutions. So a lot of times the tech industry will try to say that their lack of diversity is because of a lack of availability. I think we have to push back on that narrative too.
I love that you went there because I think it speaks to Sam. I think you said something earlier about community and having this whole, and it speaks to what you started with, Allison, about this whole community that we represent here, right? As like parts of this pipeline. We've talked about the leaky pipeline, and I've now started to think it's a pipeline full of filter paper, right? It really does just filter out Black people at every instance. So there are just spaces where K-12 is failing us. When we look at OUSD's numbers, the fact that less than 12% of Black students in 2019, because of the pandemic, we don't have 2020, 21 data, but 2019, less than 12% of Black students were at grade level in math, means that less than 12% of Black students are able to access algebra before high school. There's your filter. Let's just throw a filter right there. If you're not taking algebra in 8th grade, your access to pathways in high school, your access to higher level classes in high school is already starting to be diminished. So that's the first filter. Then we get to high school and we're looking at AP stats in the report, right? When a high school student, when a freshman Black student, I saw this so many times, comes into a high school, they're not thinking APs. A white student comes into the same high school and they're thinking, where are all the AP classes? What's the first one I can take? I would have to go on like a campaign, much like a presidential campaign, to get students to realize that AP CSP, the first AP for computer science, is actually really easy. And you can take it your sophomore year and get an AP right away, so that you are eliminating yet another filter, burn through that filter, right? And so I think you're absolutely right. There are filters literally all the way through this pipeline, all the way up until where we'll get to, which are the requirements for getting that job, which are the requirements that exclude HBCUs or discredit the credits you get from a community college and tell you that they're not, your A in community college is not the same as an A at a 4-year. There are these filters that are just, and at the 10 years, I think, Allison, we've now uncovered so many of them because we've been, well, that's a blocker. We're going to bash through it. And it's just these constant new filters that are being sprinkled in to keep Black people out. It's just really, it's intense.
No, I think all that is true, and obviously, right. We all know that pipeline is not the issue as to why the representation numbers in the tech industry are so low. I think one of the things in terms of thinking about why nothing has changed over the last decade or so, I think, Allison, what I heard you say was almost consideration as we're setting curriculum and standards and policies have to actually account as part of their MVP, right? We're talking tech. The minimal viable product is actually contemplating the diverse communities that exist and actually incorporating them into the initial stages of every policy, procedure, regulation, curriculum book that gets created, right? I think that's what I heard you say.
Absolutely, Lisa.
And I think taking that one step further, and I think you touched on this too, which is let's address the elephant in the room, right? Which is, hey, look at what's happening in Florida with math textbooks and the banning of, I just have to, in quotes, say CRT because that's not what they're banning. But Tamara, what do you think about how that affects and has an impact on students who are actually trying, or who when they do have access to this kind of curriculum, how's that going to affect them?
Yeah, I'm in one of those states. I'm in Georgia, right, where we're never far behind Florida in our kind of marginalization of Black people. And here it's not just K through 12; it's K through college that's being kind of it's in the legislation, right? And so they're looking at all of the University of System of Georgia courses and they're teaching. And I've had conversations with our state computer science program manager where he's really being pushed to not talk about equity anymore, right? Allison was here. We had a conversation with him about, all of the work around equity has been taken down off of the Department of Education's website. There's no mention of equity anymore. And so, one of the things that I've always been pushing for, and I'm glad, Allison, when you talked at the beginning, you brought this up, is that one of the mistakes that we've made is a focus on access and not equity, right? And so that is how we've ended up in this situation of, Georgia has a CS for Georgia initiative where we're trying to get computer science in every middle and high school. But that doesn't mean that that's equitable access to computer science, who's actually now in those courses. And it feels like we're kind of like doing things a bit backwards, right? And so what that means now is that we're trying to be subversive in how we bring equity into these conversations. And my suggestion is that we kind of dismantle the whole thing and start again. But because like when we talk, like Ken and you were just talking about I like that you did like filter paper, right? But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about since the beginning of the pandemic is that all of these things we constructed and we decided. And so we can decide that we want something different, right? So when we say that students need to be able to complete calculus, right? The data tells us students have to complete calculus at least by the end of their freshman year in college in order to successfully complete a STEM degree. Why is that? Right? Why is it that kids have to come into college ready to take calculus? Right? We just kind of accept it as, okay, now our job is to get them ready to be able to take calculus, as opposed to saying, well, maybe that whole thing is broken. And so just to kind of wrap all of that up, right? I think we are at a point where like we need to think about the long game, right? They always talk about the Republicans. They think about the long game. What is our long game as opposed to continuously trying to patch holes?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think thinking about it right from the systemic perspective about what's actually being set into place. And Ivory, I guess I'm curious. I mean, we talk about what we like HBCUs are putting out the most Black CS graduates. What are the impediments in place for folks who are going to four-year institutions or community colleges, but that are standing in their way of actually being able to then? I mean, I'm sorry. Besides racism, besides the filter paper, I mean, I don't know that there's a besides there, but are there concrete things that you can think of that we could help eliminate or strive to improve that you think could make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, we need more dialogue, and I was you saw I was clapping for Tamara because that's spot on. And I've had conversations with people who work in tech and asked them about the weed out courses and to what extent does the content that is taught in the weed out courses, to what extent does that show up in your day to day work? And it doesn't. It really is, just gatekeeping. It's to shrink the majors, but they're shutting out Black students. So we do need to critically examine that. Um, but there's racism that's there, and I think that the best way for us to confront the racism is to have an open dialogue about it. And we have to have these conversations. How many of you all have heard a tech company say that HBCU students or black students, especially from the South, dress too well for their interviews? Like that's racist. These are students that grew up in the South. There's the Southern tradition. They go to church on Sundays, and their mama told them that they have to wear a suit to the interview. But yet wearing that suit in Silicon Valley can make you, oh, you don't fit in, and so, these are conversations that we have to happen. Now, is the answer just telling HBCU students don't wear a suit? We could do that, but that's, kind of acquiescing to something that shouldn't take place. Both sides need to have this kind of conversation. Last thing I want to say is that, all of the legacy companies like ExxonMobil and Ford, at some point, they were under legal mandates to diversify. The Civil Rights Act came around the time when they existed. Their racism was called out, and there were legal mandates on them. There were affirmative action programs that told them that they needed to hire a certain amount, and they found a way to do it. We have this racism 2.0 that's very insidious and hard to put our finger around it, and especially because there's so many liberal actors that scream Black Lives Matter and things like that, but they've never been under any true pressure to diversify. And we need to talk about that, and what does it mean, and how do we work around that, or how do we give them the pressure that they need?
I think that's a great point. I mean, shoot, look at the diversity numbers on boards, and then all of a sudden, right, NASDAQ required, California required, and all of a sudden, magically, they've been able to find super qualified candidates. So agreed. And then also agree strongly with your point, of course, about the culture fit interview, right? That's as the disqualifying factor. I think it's very, very true. And I think the idea of mandates and other requirements are making their way through, and people are starting to write. It's about people with the money actually making those requirements for their jobs, right? For like VC, GPs, LPs, thinking about that. So Samuel, we're going to come to you, speaking of, but before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about maybe Kenan, you can address, right? So if we're not talking about four-year degree granting institutions, if we are talking about alternative pathways, if we are talking about boot camps, I guess what are the factors that kind of go into that? It turns out that representation is not much better at a minimum than in the tech fields than other places. So I guess, yeah. Any thought on why the boot camps are falling to these same issues?
So I'm gonna go to the report, right? I think we have a wonderful basis for those who are catching up on the report that are here joining us. Do dig in, do read it, like do check it out. There are more links in there that take you on a rabbit hole than you've ever had in a report, and they're nicely embedded, so it's really easy, user friendly. Um, but I understand some of these barriers because I've been able to at Bitwise kind of get in front of folks who have come out of boot camps and are still looking for that next step, looking for that job placement, looking for that entry, but they're 20 grand in debt from this boot camp. And I think the cost of entry, the cost or I saw predatory financing was written in the report. These are like just another opportunity to say, well, it's not my time and I'll go do what I normally do. And I think we as Black folks are so used to being like, all right, I didn't think that was for me. I tried it. It didn't work. I'm going to go back to what I normally do. And we have not given people the lens, the view, the new pathway. Dr. Pearson, you just said it, and I kind of am with you. Like, if we're building a Black tech workforce, and that's what we're talking about, then we're building a new pathway that supports every different entree into this tech workforce. And so it is going to start with K-12, and it is going to include HBCUs, and it has to include community colleges. And we have to be able to unify and say, no, you go to here, and this different node in this pathway, and we're going to say you've got the skills to get this job, to join this apprenticeship. And we're going to make it skills based, and we're going to remove. There are wonderful organizations coming together in Northern California to form the Northern California Apprenticeship Network, where we're really talking about at a very like high level across the board with community colleges and different organizations, like how do we get rid of the bachelor's degree? Like, how do we actually afford for people to come in and we use other training partners to get them ready for these entry level jobs in an alternative way? And we honor that. We honor the journey traveled. How do we now remove the barriers with say, I've talked to folks who are like, I've been white my whole life until I went to prison. And then suddenly I was like, oh, you were othered. Oh, yeah. Welcome. Like, come join the flock. I know exactly what you're talking about. Because we probably just need to recreate it. It's post pandemic, it's post Floyd, it's post BLM. It's time to just chant down Babylon and build the thing up ourselves. We have enough capable folks. We have the passion, we have the knowledge. There's 3 doctors in the room. I'm feeling like I need to get back and go to Howard, get my degree. Like I'm already like I can't go to Spelman, so hook it up, Ivory. Like I think this is that moment where we do it different. We don't go back to the same formula that we used after any other one of our civil outcries, right? We've had these movements before, but then we go back into our silos, right? After Rodney King, we tore it all up, and then we burned down our own neighborhoods, and we didn't do anything to build them back up. We didn't put anything back into the soil of our community to grow from. We are enough people right here in this room that I feel like we could put enough into the community to grow and to build and to create this new pathway. And I think that's really what we got to do. Like, I'm going to be honest. I think we just got to break it and build it again. Bunch of engineers in here. Let's do this.
Oh, I think that's a great point. And Samara, I'm going to come to you on this, which is to your point, right? It's about creating new pathways. And a lot of that stems from where the money comes from and who gets the money. And so, Samara, I'd love your perspective on how what the report talks about in terms of Black VC investment, but also, right, there have been a ton of funds that have cropped up in the last, let's call it, right, 20 months that are going to support Black founders. That it might feel a little bit like what's it called? Not a donation, but uh,
Handout.
a handout. Thank you. It was like whatever that, right? And then the number of people who like say that, and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm happy to give you advice." There's Tiffany Ashley Bell who says, you know, it's not about advice; it's about cut the check, it's about send the wire, cut the check. We don't need your advice. So I'd love to hear from you, Samar, about your perspective on how to make change and can we create new pathways using the power of VC.
Definitely. And I love this conversation. I feel like, you know, where venture is kind of I feel like the tip of the spear as far as inequity goes, is like probably has had the least amount of work done, like hearing from all the levers in which folks have already identified to create change from this group. And like, obviously there's still a long way to go, but like those lessons can be transposed down into the venture space. And I think my initial kind of reflections on it, and I think Kenan, you laid it out perfectly as far as the filters that are in the industry. And I think like ultimately when we're looking at the venture landscape, right, so much of it is driven by the limited partners, right? These are the people that are investing into these firms. These are the ones that are essentially dictating. They're the public pension funds, they're the university endowments, they're the high net worth individuals that these fund managers go and raise money from and say, you know, we're going to turn your $100 million to $200 million. That person writing that check to them has an immense amount of power and influence as far as how they make decisions, right? You know, from what they invest in, et cetera, et cetera. And so the limited partner part of the ecosystem is also farther behind than where venture capital is. And I'm just saying that just to kind of level set as far as where the equity landscape is as it relates to it. But I think the things that were highlighted in the report that are critical to kind of talk about, and for those of you that haven't seen the State of Black Venture reports, primarily focused on Black fund managers and partners at the more senior level. You know, there's about 83% of Black partners today have transitioned their roles in the past year to become a partner, right? So that means they either joined a new fund or launched their own fund. Of all the Black funds that have been launched, half of them were launched in the past 2 years, right? And so you're seeing this massive influx of new fund managers is incredible. It means there's new investors. These are folks with networks in HBCUs. They have like, they're in communities outside of just the Bay, New York, you know, these hubs that, you know, may not be as Black centric as others, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, etc. And they have different thesis, they have different focus, and this huge flood of capital is hopefully going to increase the amount of Black like entrepreneurs being funded. But the average, you know, first fund size is $30 million, almost half the average, the industry average, right? And I think a point of this piece that's critical to also think about, and I think needs to be solved for, and we're trying to solve for in the coming years, is that many of these fund managers raised capital from individuals and high net worths, right? And like family offices, which is pretty typical for smaller sized funds. And for those, just kind of like explain what that means, you know, if you're raising a fund that's say under $25 million, the majority of large institutional investors, the public pension funds, endowments, etc., are too big to invest into your fund. They have like mandates within their fund that say we can't make an investment less than say $10 million into a fund. We can only be 10% of a fund. Therefore, you have to have a $100 million fund minimum for us to invest, right? Which means you're going to be going to a lot of individuals, family offices, which is great because it's accessible. You know, you can get typically capital more quickly, but that's not long-term capital usually, right? You know, they may invest in this fund, they may not come in for the next one. They may invest like up to $50,000, maybe $100,000, maybe $10,000. So you're getting a whole bunch of individuals. Now the big transition is how do you go from that, you know, $25 million fund, the first fund that you launched, to that next fund that you raise, because you have to raise a fund probably every 3 years. So now how do you go from 25 to 50 to 75? Now you're going to talk to these institutions, and these institutions are, in the ivoryest of towers. They are so separated from where our ecosystem is, and they have walls and filters to ensure that these things that maybe seem race blind on paper are actually very racist in their outcomes, right? So for example, they have things that say you have to, as a fund manager, you have to put in, say, 1 or 2% of the total fund size. You have to invest that yourself. So say you're raising $100 million fund, you got to put in $1 million. You got to have $1 million liquid to put into that. So you got to be wealthy off the jump, right? So that's a filter, right? A second one is they say they won't invest into emerging managers, right? Which can mean fund 1, it can mean fund 2, it can mean up to fund 3. All right, so if we already know that half of the fund managers that are Black are emerging fund managers, right? They just recently raised a fund. What does that mean as far as how are they able to access this capital, right? I think there's the minimums that I mentioned earlier, as far as like the minimum size investment they're willing to make, or like the max percentage of a fund they can own. These are also additional barriers that seem race blind, but in practice then net out to mean Black fund managers are not going to be able to raise capital, right? Like we had our first Black fund manager have $1 billion of assets under management this year, 2 or 3 months ago, right? It was a base 10. That's incredible. We need way more of those. But the fact that 2022 is the first time we had a venture fund that's Black led, that's over $1 billion AUM, is an indication of the problems in the industry.
Right. And one follow-up question to that, and then I want to go back to the tech workforce. So there's definitely an issue in supporting Black fund managers, and they're raising their money and all of that stuff. What about the flip side of that is the pattern matching for who they invest in? Not necessarily the Black fund managers, but VCs in general. Any thoughts or suggestions there about how do we change where the money goes? Also,
that's a great question. I have some theories. I think it's I think there's a lot of people that are much smarter than me also thinking about it as well. The problem with venture capital is it prides itself in pattern matching, right? Like that is one of the biggest points of like how is a good investor? They're able to recognize winners because they recognize the patterns that will, kind of school background, kind of educational background, whatever you want to say. And so the pattern matching is the problem, but it's also how a lot of people measure success for themselves. I think parts of it is broader network access. So people are, because these venture funds are typically small, they're people are leveraging their own networks and their reach to find companies. So if you're not in somebody's network, or you're not able to get a warm introduction to this venture investor, there's no way that you're going to end up in a place for them to invest in, right? So that part of it is expanding network access, right? And that's something that Black VC does, right? We connect via Black investors, right? We connect the broader venture ecosystem to the Black venture community as a part of what we do, to ensure that some of those networks are being more easily accessed, and that a VC is meeting a peer VC that is Black, right? And a shared level of respect and shared deal sharing, which can then elicit them to invest. So I think part of it is network access. Part of it is, I love how many incubators, accelerators, organizations that are focused on Black founders have emerged over the past several years, because I think they're creating new pathways to elevate these companies to potential investors. I think that's a solution. But ultimately, I think, and this is more of a longer reach, I think it comes down to the limited partners and the founders themselves. Like the limited partners, if they say, we want you to invest in more diverse founders, you bet they're going to invest in more diverse founders. That's it. They're going to figure out how to do it, right? 100%. And then the other side of it is, if existing founders in their portfolios say, hold up, you want to invest in us, you don't have a single Black founder or brown founder or woman in your portfolio, that ain't right. Now you got to fix it, right? Once that starts to happen, then the VCs will respond, because they have to be squeezed on both sides. And so those are just some of my thoughts. I'd love to hear if anybody else thoughts on this call, but that's something I'm constantly thinking about and trying to unpack.
Yeah, I have all kinds of thoughts about it, but yeah, I mean, the point is it's follow the money, right? It's that it's money talks. So I think that that's really interesting. And so from that perspective, I think there's certainly been enough research that shows that having a more diverse workforce will make your business ultimately more successful, make your products more successful, all of those things, right? I mean, we don't those stats over and over and over again. So Allison, I guess I'm curious. So everybody's brought in, like the hypothetical, everybody's bought in. They understand why this is so important. They are hiring Black folks left, right, and center. It's working. That's the world that I like to live in. And so my question is then what, right? Because we know it's not just a pipeline issue. It's not just a onboarding and hiring issue. It really is a retention issue. It is making people feel welcome and included, like they belong at that organization. And I guess I'd love your perspective if you have thoughts on what is required to make a safe, equitable, and inclusive workplace for Black folks once they're inside your organization.
Sure. So I love living in this hypothetical. This is what we aspire to get to. So I think a couple quick points. One, I think representation, again, going back to the data, representation across all levels is required before we start talking about inclusion. So the report talked about representation at the board level and how little progress we've made there. Representation at the C-suite is critically important. So a couple studies that we've done, we did a tech leaver study back in 2017 that looked at the experiences of Black tech workers and the types of experiences that actually drove them out of the workforce. And similarly, there was a study cited in the report from DICE in 2021, so just a year ago, that showed that almost half of Black technologists reported experiencing racial inequality in hiring, promotion, leadership opportunities, salaries, and benefits. So to your point, once we get all of these folks in to have a more representative workforce across all levels, what are the specific things that we're putting in place to ensure that it is actually an inclusive environment? So it's definitely not rocket science. I want to give a nod to our co-founder, Frida Kapor-Klein, who's been on the soapbox for many, many years about building out comprehensive diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategies. So everything from leading from the top, setting explicit goals for Black representation, retention, and career progression. So that's not just like how many people do you recruit and get in the door, but how many people are you promoting? Equitable pay is another issue. Committing to transparent data reporting, tracking, and internal accountability mechanisms like tying C-suite pay to meeting those goals. Again, those goals across all points of the employee life cycle. And then I heard Dr. Toldson mention this earlier, and I think it's a really important point that I think we have to start considering what are external accountability mechanisms. So internal accountability mechanisms are things like your employees will leave, lawsuits. Maybe I'm missing a third. External accountability, we should start thinking, how are we holding companies accountable for the ways that they're treating their workers? Another piece that was cited in the report was the class action lawsuit in California against Tesla for racial discrimination. After Tesla has already paid, I think it's $135 million to Black employees, that was how bad their treatment was. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of like building inclusive cultures from the inside that we're still not seeing take place within tech companies. And we should consider like, what are the external accountability mechanisms? How can we hold tech companies accountable for the way that they're treating Black employees?
Right. I think that's right. And full disclosure, actually, the Tech Leaver study and Frida Kapor-Klein were the inspiration for why I started Techquitable. That is exactly to address the microaggressions, the micro inequities that people are facing within the organizations themselves. So absolutely. Before we get to our wrap-up question, I do want to say we haven't actually really talked about unions, and they've obviously been in the news recently, and the power there. And as we think about, right, if you want to talk about follow the money, you want to talk about shifting of power dynamics, you want to talk about setting the accountability standards within organizations. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on unionization, if that's a word. Nobody.
I don't know a lot about unions, but I know that the NAACP is on record for supporting them.
Got it. Allison, did you touch on?
Yeah, I think my only point would just be, I think it's a really important consideration for, I think, employees should be considering what their points of leverage are. And I think we're seeing a lot more of employee activism. I think it's a really positive trend. So again, I'm like Dr. Tolton, I don't know a lot of details about where this trend is moving, but I think even just seeing the Amazon union win, the votes that are cropping up, I think it's an important piece of the puzzle to think about accountability mechanisms.
Yeah, I agree. There's also some tech companies, certainly some like Code for America, who've unionized. So it's been really interesting to see. It'll be really interesting to see how it manifests in the tech industry as well, and how, again, hopefully it shifts in power dynamics.
Can I add one more thing? Just something else that we haven't talked about that I've been thinking about is what is the role of us as consumers of technology in the diversification of technology, the tech industry, right? I think that, myself included, I think I put a lot of responsibility on like the formal mechanisms like education and government, but I continue to use these products every day in my life, right? I shop at Amazon, I use Twitter, I use, Facebook, all of these things, right? And so what is my role as a consumer if I truly am wanting to have an impact on, them diversifying their workforce? So that's just something else to throw out there.
I think that's a great point. I mean, right now organizations are required to think about, or they're saying they're thinking about supplier diversity. But what is for us as consumers, right? What are our choices? How are we supporting Black businesses? Does everybody know that the CEO of Calendly is a Black man, and maybe we want to support that business, right? And so just thinking about those things as they weave in and out of our day-to-day lives. And it's a little bit hard. Like, can you get rid of PG&E or Con Edison or whoever your electric provider is, right? There's certain things that are fundamental to how we operate in the day-to-day. But on the other hand, what can we do? What is in our power to be thinking about and reflecting on to support Black businesses?
Could I also chime in, similar to just as consumers, but also as individuals' political voices? Something that we've been thinking a lot about at Black DC is that the largest aggregation of Black wealth in the U.S. today is in public pension funds, right? Because historically, those were the federal jobs, the state jobs. Those were the safest jobs where you start, you stay 35, 40 years, you get your gold watch, you retire. Those public pension funds are some of the largest funders of private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, et cetera, right? These are massive, massive institutions of capital, and they are investing, right? When you look at some of the biggest funds, look at the limited partners, it's the California Teachers Fund, it's the Texas Teachers Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And so they are susceptible to public pressure, right? They get their mandates from government. And so there's been evidence in which groups have pressured state pension funds to try to enforce specific mandates on how they allocate capital, where it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. It's currently going to people that are similar to those that you're getting your actual capital from. And there's been some progress made in Massachusetts and California, nowhere near where it has to be. But those are things that I think, it's very opaque, right? Understanding that landscape and how these pieces connect. But I think as more and more folks become aware of it, and maybe it's just an education campaign that's needed, I think there could be a large push to institutionalize this, right, and put it into actual policy to ensure that they have to, right, and once they have to, they'll figure out a way. It's not a problem. Once you make somebody do something, they'll figure it out. So
I think there's a lot of power there. That's a great point. So in my wrap-up question to you all, I think leading kind of Sam, I think, led the way in some levels, although I'm still going to come back to you on it, which is, if you had to bet all your money on one call to action, what would it be and why? Kenan is nodding, so you get to go first. And we have 3 minutes and 3.5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll be quick then and terse about it, because honestly, I thought the biggest piece that was I think the heaviest hitting part of the report was the calls to action. And I think what I really saw was the open job pathways by removing unnecessary degree requirements and screening for skills and aptitude. I think once we start really unpacking what that looks like in all these different spaces, we can make a big difference towards making apprenticeships and internships truly accessible and then equitable. because right now neither is true. And I think once we make, I feel like on my end, I am with a group that can help to push that in the tech industry and start to show through like white papers and impact reports that we're really able to do that work of opening up the pipeline, removing that barrier, and still having quality products and being companies that grow and raise more capital. Once we start showing that that data, we should be able to blow that wide open. And so I feel like the call to action there spoke to me because I'm like, yes, I want to do that every day, and I'm on it.
That makes a ton of sense. Dr. Ivory Tolson, you want to go next?
So I don't have a lot of money, but if I had a whole lot of money, I would bet on Samir and Black VC and establish huge tech companies for Black people, because I always bet on Black. And I think that if we had the capital and could invest in ourselves, then we would be able to successfully compete with the entities that are keeping us out, and they would be begging us to come back.
That is a great point. Dr. Tamara Pearson.
I think I'll get in trouble if I don't say bet on HBCUs and invest in HBCUs. Ever since I've transitioned to Spelman in the last, couple of years from Georgia Tech, I've been just dumbfounded by the lack of respect that HBCUs are given by the tech industry when they come and want to recruit our students, but not feel as though they have to invest in the capacity of the institution in order to be able to do that. And so that's where I would put my money, is on more investment in capacity building at HBCUs.
Fair point. Samar, I am going to hand it to you, and then Allison, you'll have the last word.
Well, first, I appreciate the confidence, Dr. Ivory. I appreciate that. But bet on Black all the way for sure. I would say, echoing, I think everybody's here, the one piece that I would push on was where I ended off on, is just public sector pressure. I think we need to, asking people to make changes, I think goes only so far. I think we need to change policy. I think we need to pressure at all levels, at the highest levels, to really start to get limited partners investing into Black fund managers, because that will lead to more investment into Black entrepreneurs.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dr. Allison Scott, I will hand it off for your, what is the one call to action? What would it be and why? And
so interestingly enough, Dr. Pearson took mine. I am also an HBCU graduate, but I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned about the successes of HBCUs. And so if we were to fund them sustainably and provide the resources, there's a chart that talks about the lack of the endowment comparisons, like how we're producing Black graduates. So if we think about sustainable investments in HBCUs, and a way to incorporate all of the parts of the tech ecosystem, so not just focusing on degree completion, but how are we developing computer science teachers? How are we building out computing pathways and pipelines, and focus on the investor entrepreneurship and commercialization component? I think that would have the biggest payoff. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we are at the state now because we have not made long-term investments in systems change. And so I think we have to think about what are the systems that we're trying to change across all of the stages of the pipeline. But again, as Kenan mentioned, the recommendations, please read and review those and provide your suggestions too for how we can take action on those. Lisa, did you want to say what your bet would be? I'm kicking it back to you.
Oh my. I was just gonna say, I actually have really, really enjoyed this conversation because we spend the entire gamut, right? From K to 12 through secondary, through bootcamp, through VC, through institutional pension funds. Like, I just think that there is so much fodder for conversation there. I have made my bet in building Techquitable, right? It really is about creating safe, equitable, inclusive workplaces. It really is about, right, we can bring people in, but if we're burning them out and they're leaving, right, there is such an opportunity to use working at tech companies to change the wealth gap, to change how we actually relate to ourselves, to change the products that we build, which ultimately affect our GDP, affect how we interact with everything. I just think there's so much opportunity there, and for us to be able to have a seat at the table, and that is, I've made my bet. Those are where I'm investing my dollars and my time, and for Techquitable. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you so much for moderating this wonderful conversation. Hopefully it's the first of many. Let's continue to have these conversations and start to take the action that we know is needed. So again, thank you to Dr. Toldson, Dr. Pearson, Ken and Scott, Samer Youssef, and thank you all for joining us today. Please check out the report, and I think there's also a link that's going to be dropped into the chat just to provide feedback on the session and anything else you might want to learn in the future. And again, thank you to the report authors who I know are also listening in and joining in on the chat, and thank you all for joining us.
Stowaway.